This is the LG G2 screen repair guide brought to you by RepairsUniverse.com. The recommended tools to perform this repair are plastic pry tools, a nylon spudger, small Phillips screwdriver, tweezers, a heat gun or a hair dryer, and adhesive strips. The first thing we're going to do is remove the back cover. Take your plastic pry tool and insert it between the seam of the back cover and mid-frame, starting with the corner. Slide your pry tool along all edges and corners until you release all of the clips that's holding the back cover in place. Once you have released the majority of the clips, you should be able to remove the back cover completely. With the back cover now removed, you will have 7 screws that you will need to remove using your small Phillips screwdriver. Please keep in mind that only one of these screws is black and is different and should go in the same location during reassembly. On the bottom right of your screen, you will see we have these screw locations circled in red. Now that all the screws are removed, you will need to remove this back housing. Take your pry tool and gently release it from the clips in order to remove it from the mid-frame. Next, we're going to remove the loudspeaker. You will have 5 small Phillips screws that you'll need to remove in order to pry up the loudspeaker. At the top right of your screen, you will see we have these 5 screw locations circled in red for your reference. Then take your pry tool and gently release it from the housing. Next, you will need to disconnect flex cable connections for various components on the motherboard. This will allow you to remove the motherboard and daughter board, which is located at the bottom of the device. Highlighted in yellow are 6 pop connections that you will need to disconnect using your pry tool. Gently pry up from underneath the connections to release them from their sockets. Running along both sides of the device are 2 long ribbon cables which act as a bridge from the daughter board to the motherboard. You will next need to disconnect the flex cable connections highlighted in red to remove the daughter board. Starting on the right side, take a spudger and gently release the pop connection. Then what you're going to do is insert your spudger underneath the ribbon cable assembly to release the adhesive that's holding it to the motherboard. Gently peel up to release the adhesive and then feed the ribbon cable down towards the bottom to release it entirely. You may have a small piece of tape that's holding it to the battery and inner housing. Then move over to the left side and release the pop connection. And then peel up the ribbon cable from the adhesive. Next, we're going to remove the daughter board. You will have 2 pop connections, as you see highlighted in yellow, as well as 2 antenna connections, which is circled in red. Use your pry tool to gently release the pop connections and antenna cables. When disconnecting these antenna cables, you want to get as close as possible to the socket itself and be careful not to damage the cable. Tweezers can also be a useful tool if used carefully. Optionally, you could have disconnected the antenna cables from the motherboard itself, but in this case, you don't really need to. Once all of the connections have been released, use your spudger to pry from underneath the daughter board to pry it up from the adhesive securing it to the inner housing. Keep in mind that the charging port, headphone jack, and microphone are all components connected to this daughter board. Work your spudger around all sides until you have found a comfortable entry point to get underneath the board to pry it up. You'll want to be very cautious of the microphone when doing this because it is seated in a special slot in the housing. If the tiny black noise-canceling bushing happens to come off during this process, don't worry, it can be easily reinstalled. With the daughter board now removed, we can begin to remove the motherboard. First, make sure none of your connections have reseated themselves and they are not in the way when lifting out the motherboard. Take your spudger or plastic pry tool and begin working along the edges to lift out the motherboard from the inner housing. Be very careful when releasing the antenna cables from the side of the housing. It is very wise to remove these antenna cables completely because the heat we are going to apply to the screen assembly could actually damage these antenna cables quite easily. With the motherboard now removed, we're going to apply heat to the front of the screen assembly to warm and loosen the adhesive that's holding it in place. We are using a heat gun on a high setting and we're going to apply heat along all edges for roughly 25 seconds. If you're using a hair dryer or your heat gun on a lower setting, you may need to use it upwards to 60 seconds or more. Give it a few seconds to cool down because the glass can be extremely hot. Now you can begin to pry out your screen assembly. Wedge your pry tool between the glass and outer frame in order to pry out the screen assembly from the inner housing. Slide it along all edges of the screen to release the adhesive that's holding it in place. If your screen is completely shattered, you may want to apply a few pieces of clear tape to try and reduce the amount of glass shards from cutting your fingers or just getting all over the place. This particular phone has had a screen protector, which should keep most of the screen intact. If you find it difficult to pry up a portion of your screen, it may be because the adhesive has cooled down and you'll have to reapply heat in order to loosen it up again. At the bottom of this screen you can see it's fairly shattered, and there will most likely be leftover pieces of glass that we'll need to pry up from the inner housing. Make sure to free up the ribbon cables at the bottom of the screen and feed them through the slots in the housing. There are two slots for the bottom of the screen that you'll have to be aware of when reinstalling a new screen. Just like us, you may have some leftover pieces of glass on your housing. Just simply pry them up or remove them and peel off all of the old adhesive. Next, you will want to cut and apply adhesive strips to the inner housing. The areas highlighted in red shown in the figure to the left of your screen are the ideal spots you'll want to cover to ensure a long-lasting hold. Be sure to feed the ribbon cables through their appropriate slots in the housing, then press firmly along all edges to ensure a flush fit. We highly suggest doing a dry run first to quickly test the screen before sealing it to the housing with adhesive. Now we're ready to reinstall the motherboard. When doing this, be sure that all of the flex cable connections are not getting trapped underneath the motherboard, so it snaps back into its proper place. Once you feel your motherboard start to snap into place, you can begin reconnecting the connections as necessary. Next, we're going to reinstall the daughter board. Make sure the ribbon cables for the LCD screen and hotkeys are fed through the housing properly and the microphone is seated in its correct spot on the housing. Again, if the noise-canceling bushing happens to fall off your microphone, simply stick it back on and feed the microphone in the proper slot. After the microphone has been seated properly, you can reconnect the flex cables, highlighted in yellow, as well as the antenna cables, which are circled in red. Make sure to feed the antenna cables properly in the slot along the side of the housing. This can be tricky if the cables are not seated in the correct angles. Using tweezers can help you secure the connections properly and make sure that the cable stays flush inside that slot. Once you have fed the antenna cables properly along the side, you can start reconnecting the pop connectors on both sides of the motherboard. Be sure to press firmly on the ribbon cables to make sure that they are adhered on the battery and the side of the housing. Referring to the figure on the right-hand side of your screen, make sure that all 8 flex cable connections are secured properly on the motherboard. Next, we're going to reinstall the upper rear housing. Press firmly along all sides until you feel each clip snap back into place. Next, we're going to reinstall the 7 small Phillips screws in the locations you see circled in red. Be cautious of the one black screw towards the bottom left that you'll have to reinstall in that particular place. Now, reinstall your loudspeaker and secure it with the 5 small Phillips screws in locations you see circled in red. Lastly, snap your back cover in place and make sure that all of the clips are secured properly. Then, turn on your device and see if your screen assembly works. Congratulations, you have just repaired the LG G2. If you found this video useful, please like it below. Also, subscribe to our channel for more repair tutorials. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter for news, updates, and exclusive discounts. And remember, all of the replacement parts and tools you need to fix your device can be found at www.repairsuniverse.com.